Hey guys, what's going on? Laying back for another Netflix review, and today I'm going to be talking about Love in the Villa. Love in the Villa is an American romantic comedy that tells the story of Julie Hutton, a third-grade teacher who plans a trip to Verona in Italy with her boyfriend, but he breaks up with her before the trip. She decides to go on her trip alone and arrives at her Airbnb on schedule and meets a British man named Charlie once she arrives. The two initially don't take kindly to each other, especially once they realize that the room they rented was double booked on accident, forcing the two to stay together. But while they get off to a rocky start, things eventually warm up between the two, which leads to an inevitable romance. The title alone gives a pretty good idea of how generic the movie could be, and it ends up being exactly that. It's neither terrible nor fantastic, sitting squarely in the middle in terms of quality, and thus being yet another ordinary rom-com that wouldn't be out of place on the Hallmark Channel. The main character, Julie, is sympathetic on a basic level on account of her breakup, but what ended up being more interesting about her was her obsession with Italian culture. She actually comes prepared for a variety of new experiences during her travels, which was a nice change of pace from the usual fish-out-of-water scenarios that are done in other rom-coms set in foreign settings. In the end, though, she was still pretty bland as a protagonist. Once her trip gets underway, she doesn't start off doing a whole lot outside of her villa, and her obsession with Romeo and Juliet starts to get weird after a while, especially considering the movie already has a romantic vibe going for it. Then there's her love interest Charlie Fletcher, and he ended up being this movie's biggest saving grace. His casual sarcasm and dry wit in response to Julie's serious nature made him a great source of comic relief, especially as the dynamic ramps up between them. There's also a decent amount of depth behind him, and that he secretly wants to buy a plot of land in Italy so that he can set up his own vineyard and escape from the rigors of his job as a business executive. It's not entirely original, but him having a goal to pursue outside of the romance did make him more endearing, even if it's mostly only focused on in dialogue. The romance is obviously the main attraction for this movie, and with it being about a pair of polar opposites, it pretty much proceeds exactly as one might expect. The characters meet, there's initial friction, then it fades and the two get along, drop hints of something more building, then conflict emerges, and so on and so on. The initial friction between the two is probably the most notable phase between them, though I wouldn't say it's the best. It ends up constituting a large amount of this movie's comedy, in which one tries to get the other to leave the villa through increasingly ridiculous scenarios so that one can have it for themselves. For the kind of movie it is, this type of comedy is okay for the most part, but some of these situations are well beyond ridiculous. A good example is when Julie gets Charlie sent to jail, and he responds by airing out dirty laundry from her diary into the public, which one is a pretty lame retort, and two, he apologizes for his actions despite Julie being the one who got him arrested. Because of situations like this, it took a long time for the movie to convince me of the chemistry of its lead characters, but thankfully things do improve later on. Julie's knowledge of Italy contrasts with Charlie's lack of it, and this eventually results in the two participating in and enjoying a variety of activities outside of the villa. It was nice seeing these two get to know each other on a deeper level like an actual normal pair of people would, instead of being at each other's throats so much. I think this is what left the romance feeling so half-baked to me, as there's just not enough time given to let things properly marinate, which is odd considering this movie clocks in at almost 2 hours. Despite the romance itself falling flat a bit, the romantic atmosphere is top-notch and elevated by its Italian setting. The Roman architecture, countryside vineyards, and an authentic soundtrack make it a treat to watch from both an audio and visual perspective. Between the different foods and dealing with the crowds of Rome, the movie leans heavily into Italian culture, which I'd honestly rather see as opposed to some lame love story set in rural USA or something like that. It just gives the movie a more memorable sense of style without being overly stereotypical. The movie, however, isn't totally free of stereotypes. Not only is the romance typical for the genre, but it features quite a few cliches too, such as a gay best friend for Julie who barely appears in the movie at all, and it continues to reinforce the trope of Italians being crazy drivers with the character Uberto. It was already annoying when this exact same trope was used in a very similar rom-com this year called Love and Gelato, and seeing it here again is even more grating. And as much as I enjoyed seeing this movie's world outside the villa, I was disappointed with how much time was spent inside of it. It feels like the first half of the movie is set almost exclusively in this small space, which made it kind of a boring slog to sit through at times. It's likely that this movie was filmed on a shoestring budget, which it definitely looks like at times when there's CGI involved. And credit where it's due, the filmmakers at least tried to make the most of what they had to work with. Julie and Charlie do enough in and around the villa to keep things somewhat interesting, and there's even some surprisingly creative cinematography that gives flavor to the interior shots. Toward the end of the movie, conflict inevitably shows up between both lead characters, and without spoiling too much about it, it isn't exactly unique in its approach. Charlie's case is especially weird as there's no hint or warning about it coming up, which might make sense in a real-life context, but for a structured story, it's quite confusing. I know it may seem like I'm ranting about this movie, but like I said earlier, I actually didn't think it was that bad, just uninspired. It's a comfort viewing experience told from a more mature point point of view, and I'll take this over any of the bad teen romance flicks that Netflix has put out just in the last few months alone. Overall, Love in the Villa is exactly what its title suggests, a love story set in a villa, and doesn't strive for much more beyond that. If you like rom-coms, especially familiar ones in the same vein as those on the Hallmark Channel, this one will be right up your alley. I can't say I was impressed by its cliche and unoriginal story structure, but the characters and the activities they do make it more engaging. At the very least, it does exactly what it sets out to do, and there is something to respect with that in mind. What did you think about this movie? Did you also find it pretty average, or do you not mind watching love stories like this? Let me know in the comments below. Anyways guys, that's going to wrap up my review of Love in the Villa. Thanks for watching this video, I hope you enjoyed it, and as always stay tuned for the next part where next time I review the Brazilian comedy Fenced In. Bye bye!